Hello. Today we're going to talk about the French Revolution. It's very different from the American Revolution for many reasons, and that'll be part of what we explore. But we'll also talk about the creativity or lack thereof that occurred during the French Revolution, and I think you'll see how because of the lack of creativity, it made the revolutionary issues much more difficult in France than in the United States. One of the similarities and differences was the people's perception of government in France versus in the United States. In France, the people saw themselves as subjects of the king. In the United States, of course, that wasn't the case. They saw government not as something that ruled over them, but as a servant of the people, as a tool of the people. Obviously, in the United States, there was very loyalty to King George III. They felt no problem at all by breaking their ties with King George, whereas in France, there was tremendous loyalty. You have to remember that French psychology and personal esteem was tied up with the wonders of the French crown from the days of Louis XIV. He identified himself with the French nation and the French people, and therefore, as Louis became ever more glorious and grand, France became ever more glorious and grand. And that same concept continued through Louis XV's reign into Louis XVI's reign. And therefore, if the French people threw off their king through an act of disloyalty like a revolution, they were in danger of throwing off their own prestige. A very important point for them. The level of revolt was also a difference between the two countries. In the United States, it was a war, but it was not a war of anger, not a war of retribution, not a war of vengeance, whereas all of those issues were present in the French Revolution. Also, there is a difference in leadership. In the United States, the leadership was the Second Continental Congress that made the laws that governed throughout the war, and obviously the Army under the control of George Washington, an esteemed leader by almost all of the people in the United States. In France, there were various factions that were competing for leadership, and they fought openly. And control of the revolution shifted from one faction to another, and that caused tremendous difficulties. In the United States, the vision of the revolution was, this is something that we must do in order to improve the lives of all people in a philosophical way as well as in an actual way. In France, it was, this is something we must do to get out from under the terrible despotic rule and the terrible situations that are coming up daily in their lives because of the excesses of the French nobility. In the case of America, there was foreign support. It was difficult to obtain, but France and Holland and later other countries gave support to the American Revolution. In the case of France, there was almost no international support. In fact, it was just the opposite. In the height of the revolution, France was invaded by the other European nations, and so France felt like they were fighting everyone, and in fact, they were. The other problem, or the other difference, is distance. In France, their enemies and the king's troops were all mixed together within the same country, and not only that, there was proximity of their enemies from outside the other nations. In America, there was an ocean separating the two warring parties, and therefore it made a big difference in the ability of Great Britain to pursue the war with the Americans, whereas in France, there was almost no problem in immediate access to the French nation itself. Well, clearly the French and American revolutions were related, not only all of these differences, but France looked at the American Revolution, and that spurred some revolutionary fervor in France. Let's talk about why it gained traction, why revolutionary fervor had a place that it could be nurtured within the hearts of the French people. In essence, what was wrong in France at the dawn of the French Revolution? Beginning with Louis XIV, France had become financially depleted from wars and extravagances. Louis and his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, were spendthrifts, and they wanted to live in a very high, luxurious style, and the country just couldn't stand that kind of expense. In addition to that, there were near continuous wars, and of course that chews up lots of money. For instance, France was spending 50% of its total revenues on interest for loans to the government. Just to give you a comparison, the U.S. currently spends about 5% on national debt. So you can imagine how difficult it was for the French king, for the French government, to just pay the debt because 50% of all of their revenues were going to service that debt. Well, why couldn't they just increase taxes and get more money? Here's one of the problems. Taxes in France fell mostly on the third estate, that is, the common people. And you'd say, well, they don't have any money. But remember that in those days, the merchant class was considered part of the common people. So all of those merchants, small and large, manufacturers and others, were the ones who paid the bulk of the taxes. No royalty paid taxes. It was one of the privileges of royalty that you not pay taxes. And most of the land in France was owned by two groups, the royalty and the church. And the church paid no taxes. And therefore, we have no effective tax on property and no effective tax on income from property. In an agricultural society, as France was in the 1700s, that is a disaster for the government. There was only so much money that you can get out of the merchant class, and that limit was very close to being exceeded. To make things worse, 1787 to 1789, those years, the years of the beginning of the Revolution, were years of very poor harvests. That meant that the price of agricultural goods was going to go up. And as the price of agricultural goods went up, the poor people who had very low incomes were squeezed. Really, truly, the price of bread was becoming a critical factor. And therefore, they had to find some way, the government had to find some way to relieve the burden of just feeding themselves for the poor. This group, the poor people, were the third estate. Remember, we have three estates. The first estate is the church. The second estate is the royalty. The third estate is everybody else. And the third estate were irate at the oppressive and extravagant behavior of the Ancien regime. Let me just describe what that is. Ancien regime means the old regime, and that is simply the way things were. The royalty and the church and their methods of existence that had continued from the Middle Ages, that was all part of what is called the Ancien regime. And then French people, especially intellectuals in the middle class, what we would call the third estate's elite, that group were enchanted with the success of the American Revolution, and they believed that they could have a similar success in France. Well, the French Revolution can be conveniently divided into stages. So let's look at each of those stages in turn. The first stage was 1789 to 1793. In this stage, the precursor to the actual date of open hostilities, the king, and that's King Louis XVI, tried to increase taxes on the third estate to stabilize the economy. He was unsuccessful in doing that because, first, the nobility complained because they weren't consulted. They absolutely refused to accept any tax on themselves, but they also wanted to be a partner with the king in ruling the country, and they believed that they should have been consulted on any kind of increase in taxes. This is somewhat similar to the issue that occurred in England, where the king was prohibited from raising taxes unless he got permission from Parliament. To some extent, that's true in France as well. And rather than Parliament, the word or the body in France that made the laws was called the Estates General, and it was a collection of all three estates. The first, the nobility, the church, the second, the nobility, and the third, everybody else, had equal representation in a body called the Estates General. And they felt, the Estates General, or the nobility especially, felt that they had some power in deciding whether or not taxes could be granted. The middle class wanted the Estates General to decide because that's the only place they had a vote. So they wanted all issues of taxes to be thrown to the Estates General. There were issues back and forth, some legal decisions made in France, and finally the king agreed, realizing that if he was going to get any new taxes, they would have to come either from increased taxes on the middle class or from some kind of a tax on either the church or the nobility. And in order to make that stick, the king decided that he would convene the Estates General. To give you a feeling for what a big step that was, the Estates General had not met for 175 years. That is obviously going to be a change in the history of France. Therefore, the king called the Estates General into session, and he agreed that any legislation required the approval of a majority of the estates. That is, there's 3 estates. They would vote as a group. The first estate would have a majority rule, the second estate majority rule, the third estate majority rule, and then the 3 estates, 1, 2, 3 would vote, and the vote would be 3-0, 2-1, or whatever. That's a problem for the third estate. The problem was this: the first estate and the second estate almost always voted together, and therefore the third estate was angry, and they wanted to have an independent voice, one that could be as loud as the first 2 estates together. Therefore, in the midst of the meeting of the Estates General, those delegates who were part of the third estate walked out. They refused to meet with the rest of the Estates General. They actually went to an indoor tennis court, and they met at an indoor tennis court, and they made a commitment among themselves that they would continue to meet as a separate body or independent of the Estates General until their demands were met. And their demands were that they would have an equal voice with the others. Eventually, the king was forced to allow the first 2 estates to join with the third estate. And when that occurred, a new name was given. The term Estates General was defunct. The new name given was the National Assembly. When you hear that name, you must remember that the National Assembly is a body consisting of all 3 estates, but the numbers have been changed and the voting pattern has been changed so that the common people have equal power with the nobility and with the church. They met in June of 1789 in the indoor tennis court to draft a constitution. The king later ordered that the Estate General meet with that group, and everybody met together. And when they met, the first and second estates sat on the right-hand side of the tennis court area, and the third estate sat on the left. And it's from that seating arrangement that today we get conservatives are on the right and liberals and radicals are on the left. It's because that's the way the estates broke down when they sat in the National Assembly. One of the steps that they achieved was the formation of a municipal government for Paris. Paris was a special case. Most of the agitation for reform was occurring in Paris. Most of the riots and the other difficulties that were starting to emerge because of the bread crisis were occurring in Paris. And therefore, Paris needed a strong, unified municipal government. And the Estates General formed that government in order to try and quell the chaos that they could feel was arising. Well, that government had very little in the way of armaments, and so they wanted to get some rifles and other armaments so that they could control the mobs in Paris. The municipal government therefore sent a contingent to a place where they knew arms were being stored. It was an armory, and it was also a prison. It was a place in Paris called the Bastille. So the municipal government representatives went to the Bastille and demanded that they be given arms. The soldiers who were in charge of the Bastille were loyal to the king, and they believed that it was unnecessary, even harmful, to give those arms to this group of municipal representatives. Therefore, there was a confrontation. The gates of the Bastille were bridged, and the Bastille was overrun. The guards, that is the army people, were killed, and all of the prisoners were set free. When that happened, it was a trigger for revolution throughout the country. People saw that a group had defied the soldiers of the king, and they believed that it was appropriate at that time to revolt and to make a violent change in the country. One of the first things that was attacked were churches. Churches were highly unpopular because the church people were mostly royalty. They lived a life of luxury. Remember, the church paid no taxes, but the church exacted a 10% tithing on all of the people, and that was required by law. Therefore, the people resented the church. They saw very little return for their 10%. They saw lives of clergymen that were profligate, and therefore they just didn't like the church. Not only that, the doctrines of the Catholic Church were to some extent being ridiculed by the people, especially the doctrine of statues, which the people believed was an indication of worship of idols. And therefore the people went into the churches and they destroyed many of the statues. They had knocked their noses off, a process called defacing. And they also lopped off the heads of the statues and other things. And they stole the treasures from the churches to try and buy bread and, of course, other things. This was the time when Versailles was stormed by a group of peasant women. They not only wanted to attack the church, but they wanted to get some kind of relief from the crown. So the women marched from the city of Paris out to Versailles, a long march, by the way. And when they got to Versailles, they demanded to be heard. They demanded that something be done with the price of bread. It was at this point that Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," Marie Antoinette being the Queen of France. Well, whether she said "let them eat cake" or not is immaterial. What happened is the women who had marched out there were dangerous, and therefore something had to be done. Rather than confront them, a decision was made to appease them. And therefore the army came out with bread, gave them bread, even stuck a loaf of bread onto a bayonet, and marched the women back into Paris. And there was no major disruption other than a march that embarrassed the king and embarrassed the government and boded for the problems that might be coming hereafter. Well, the king still had to have money. The terrible harvest continued. The government was bankrupt. Something had to be done, and therefore, finally, the king issues what is called the destruction of privilege. And this is a statement, fiat, in which the king removes the tax exemption from the nobility. So now the nobility is subject to tax, but you can imagine the anger in the nobility toward the king. The king had, at this point, lost the support of the people and the nobility. The National Assembly wrote a Declaration on the Rights of Man, a wonderful document patterned after the Constitution, actually after the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but it has some other issues in it besides just a listing of the rights. And that Declaration of the Rights of Man was established on the 26th of August in 1789. A new constitution reorganizing the government was established by the National Assembly, and this made the government of France a constitutional monarchy. They also enlarged the vote, and they allowed that any landowner could now vote. They felt that landowners would have a vested interest in the government, more so than the peasantry, and therefore they allowed landowners, all landowners, to vote. Many properties of the church and personal properties of priests and bishops were confiscated during this time as another way of getting funds. And in essence, there was a break with the Catholic Church, and France separated itself from the Catholic Church, alarming the Church, alarming the Pope, and that break would not be healed until the time of Napoleon. So why would the government secularize the church? Why did they take all of these church possessions? Well, simply it was another way to get money, and the church was the richest single entity in all of France, the largest single landholder. Louis XVI hated every single move made by the National Assembly. He saw it as a diminution of his own power. He saw it as an affront to his personal prestige, and he fought it every step of the way. Nevertheless, it was all done. Louis could not avoid the issue that he was now a constitutional monarch. But it angered him, and he decided that he was going to flee France, go to Austria, where his brother-in-law, Joseph II, was the emperor, and he would then gather an army of dissatisfied exiles from France and return and defeat the National Assembly's government. The king and his family went off in a carriage and they tried to flee, but they were caught. And it was obvious that they were deserting France and that they were going to return with an army. That was held to be an act of treason. The king was therefore imprisoned along with the rest of his family. Even more than the danger of being imprisoned, this fleeing of the area caused a major change in mentality for the people of France. At this point, they started to say, we are no longer subjects to the king. We are citizens of France. A very distinct difference. They did not view themselves as being under a king. They viewed themselves as uniting together to be part of a country, France, and they were all part of it. You could see strong Enlightenment principles emerging in this concept. Austria and Prussia at that point declared war on France. They saw the imprisonment of the king as a terrible precedent. They didn't want to have that happen in their countries, and therefore war broke out between France and its nearest neighbors, Austria and Prussia. There was tremendous nationalism in France over this issue. The reason is simply that France believed that they were being invaded and perhaps conquered by outside people. France, the country that had been the most powerful country in Europe for a century, was now being relegated to possible invasion and conquer. They saw incoming hordes as being evil, and therefore, in the midst of this revolutionary and nationalistic fervor, the French national anthem, the Marseillaise, was composed. Let's play it now, and I want you to look at the words and sense the anger and the nationalism, the anger at outside invaders and the strong nationalism of this national anthem. The invasion of France by these outside enemies caused a change in the government. There was a group called the Jacobins. They were a political party composed mostly of lawyers, but also of some intellectual middle-class people, besides lawyers. And they felt that the government of France was unable to solve its problems with the National Assembly acting as a very large group. And therefore they proposed, and their proposal was adopted, that a committee be formed that would take executive power. And they called the Committee for Public Safety. The leader of that group was Citizen Robespierre, and other Jacobins participated. There were some things that the Committee for Public Safety did that were superb. For instance, they reorganized all of the measuring system. In fact, they adopted the metric system, and it is from this moment that the metric system began and was a national system for France, and obviously many other countries adopted it. They changed the calendar. They felt that the old calendar was confusing with various months of various days and funny names and so on. And so they adopted a very systematic, intellectual calendar. You can see the effect of the Enlightenment. Everything rational, everything intellectual. They adopted universal suffrage, a radical concept in any European nation at that time. Slavery was eliminated and land was redistributed. So you can see that many of the reforms that probably should have been made many years before were now made very, very quickly by this Committee for Public Safety. But the Committee for Public Safety wanted to do something else, and this is probably the place where they got into the most difficulty. Any dissent at all was to be punished by death. Not only that, any person who was tainted by previous association with the Ancien regime, either someone who was minor nobility or major nobility, or perhaps a landholder who did not pay appropriate taxes, or members of the church who were known to be corrupt, all of those people were to be killed. And the way that they were to be killed was an intellectual, scientific way. A new device was invented, the guillotine. And that device was invented for efficient killing of all of these people who were enemies of the Republic. And therefore, the Reign of Terror began. Some of those killed on the guillotine were the king and later the queen. Almost anyone who was part of the Ancien regime, anyone who was opposed to the revolution, and to give you a feeling for it, in less than a year, 20,000 people were tried and executed. Robespierre was in charge, and then Robespierre became a victim of his own instrument of death. Here's a video that talks about what happened to Robespierre and the reason that he was eventually committed to the guillotine as well.
With the Dantonists out of the way, Robespierre launches France into an even bloodier, more horrifying period. The Great Terror.
The Great Terror is the name given to the last phase of the terror in the spring of 1794 into the summer of 1794. It's the period at which the tempo of executions really starts to increase, at which the atmosphere of paranoia, particularly in Paris, but really across the country, starts to increase exponentially. You can track the number of executions until it's up to almost 800 per month in Paris, towards the end even more.
Paris's executioner is busier than ever. But on June 6, 1794, the roll of the carts comes to a halt. The guillotine hangs silent. Robespierre has declared a new religious holiday, the Festival of the Supreme Being. He wants to replace the old Catholic god with a new one, the goddess of reason.
One thing about Robespierre is that he never supported these atheist policies. He believed that people needed a divinity to believe in. And he helped sponsor this cult that was called the Cult of the Supreme Being, with this extraordinary tableau in Paris in, I believe it was June of 1794, which had choirs of people dressed in white singing. You had this kind of papier-mâché mountain that was built in the center of Paris. And then at the critical moment of the ceremony, you had Robespierre himself sort of emerging on the top of this mountain, clad in a toga, and marching down. And I think at this moment, a lot of people felt, all right, who does he really think he is? Does he think he's God here? Does he think he's the king?
As the Great Terror spirals on, Robespierre's colleagues see the Festival of the Supreme Being as his departure from the realm of reality.
There are those who think that Robespierre really has reached so extreme and so unreasonable a position that he can't turn back, that his fanaticism has somehow overtaken him, and there are those who think he's just gone nuts.
Once again, Robespierre's suspicions turn to those closest at hand. On June 27th, now the 9th of Thermidor, he appears before the convention and delivers a speech of threats. It is the last speech he will ever give.
Robespierre makes a tactical error. He comes in and announces that he has a new list of enemies of the Republic, but he won't give the list. Therefore, everyone is afraid they might be on the list, and when he comes back the next day to give the list, he is arrested before he can speak.
An unexpected chorus of voices shouts Robespierre down. He is stunned into silence. The deputies declare him an outlaw and immediately remove him from the convention. Robespierre and several of his associates are taken to City Hall, where they remain under watch for the night. Shots ring out in the early morning. Guards race to the second floor. They fling the doors open to a grisly scene. One of Robespierre's allies has thrown himself from the window. Another has taken a pistol to his head. And Robespierre is found semi-conscious with a bullet wound to the face, his jaw shattered from an apparent suicide attempt. Robespierre spends his last hours on the table of the Committee of Public Safety, in the very room where he had piloted the terror to its hideously bloody peak. As he is ridiculed and insulted by his former colleagues, Robespierre is unable to respond. The Grand Master of Oratory has been silenced. In the Conciergerie, where the last Queen of France had preceded him, Robespierre is prepared for the national razor. His cellmate, the revolutionary Saint-Just, points to a painting of the rights of man and declares, "At least we did that." Robespierre had spearheaded a revolution and changed the face of France. He had reordered society and engineered a bloody and tyrannical system to ensure its success. But he was destined to be one of its final victims.
It turns out that there is a great deal of enthusiasm for ending the terror. Nobody can figure out how to do it. And what turns out to be the case is that the only thing that will end the terror, and apparently the only thing they can all agree upon, is the fall of Robespierre.
On July 27, 1794, the guillotine comes down on the incorruptible. And the last blood of the terror is shed. The terror dies with Robespierre, but the revolution does not. The rights of man, democracy, the new republic, the accomplishments of the revolution would far outlive any of the revolutionaries themselves. France would enter a period of uncertainty, frozen between fear of another terror, or worse yet, a return to the oppressive monarchy that preceded it. 5 stagnant years would pass before power once again consolidated in the hands of a single man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Historians disagree over the end of the revolution. Some believe it died with the rise of Napoleon. Others maintain that the revolution lived on into the 19th century and beyond.
The revolution was the first and enduring model of a people taking its destiny in its own hands. The idea that the subjects of the oldest, the most established, the most glorious monarchy in Europe could decide to completely rewrite their history was something that had extraordinary resonance.
The revolution tore apart the old feudal fabric of Europe and forever changed the course of Western civilization.
The question raised by the French Revolution is how much violence is justified in achieving a better society. Do people have the right to overthrow what they see as an unjust system, to replace it with what they are convinced in their hearts is a more just system? How much violence is justified in doing that? We still face this question today.
As Robespierre and his colleagues were driving their country into the future, many of them must have wondered what the final outcome would be. More than 200 years after the birth of the French Republic, the ghost of Robespierre hangs over revolutions from Russia to Vietnam, China to Latin America. The French experiments with democracy have inspired models all over the world. Wherever tyranny takes root, the cry for justice is eternal, for liberty, equality, fraternity, for revolution.
I'd like to ask you a question to think about for a moment. Was the Committee for Public Safety effective? You might say, well, most certainly they were effective in some of the things that they did, adopting the metric system, land distribution, and so on. They were also effective in eliminating their enemies. But were they really effective in governing the country? Did they provide the leadership that needed to be provided to establish a base and a fundamental for the French Republic? I think a much more difficult question to answer. The other question that you might contemplate is whether or not the sort of violence that we saw during the Reign of Terror, is that ever justifiable? Is it ever allowable for a government to purge its own people? There certainly have been some governments that have done that. Millions died in Russia because they disagreed with Stalin. But we wonder whether or not the government has assumed an entity that puts itself above the people rather than the servant of the people. And certainly any kind of mass slaughter of this type would be forbidden to a government that was a servant. What lesson did the people learn from this radical form of government? Well, they turned out the Reign of Terror. They turned out the Committee for Public Safety. They returned to a more moderate government because they realized that the Republic of France could not continue with radicals such as those on the Committee for Public Safety at their head. So the third stage of the revolution was then ushered in. A return of the moderates from 1794 to 1799. The moderates realized that they could not rule as a whole National Assembly. They had to have a committee or a small group to make decisions. And so they formed this new small group in what is called the Thermidorian reaction. It's called that because it happened during the month of Thermidor, one of the new names. It means the hot month. And it was June and July of 1794. And this group adopted a new moderate constitution of a republic, and they established a group in charge called the Directory, a committee. So it was ruled by committee as the executive, and then ruled by the National Assembly as the legislative. Pardon me. But they had continuing economic problems. They had confusion by ruling by committee. No one was really in charge. All the committee members had equal power. Therefore, this committee, the Directory, decided that they would have to have a group of consuls, a small group of powerful people who could be the actual executive body of the Republic. And they invited Napoleon to be one of those consuls. Almost immediately, Napoleon staged a mini coup d'etat, and he eliminated the other consuls and became the sole consul. But we'll talk about that in more detail in the next lecture. The question for now is, did the French Revolution succeed? Well, certainly they overthrew the Ancien regime, but we will see that in the end, the French Revolution was a failure in some respects because upon Napoleon's defeat, the French Revolution reverted to the Ancien regime, to Louis XVI's brother as the king. But nevertheless, there were fundamental changes in the country, and those changes could not be reversed. And so to some extent, the revolution was a success. Thank you very much.